And when people present nonsensical positions justified by this claim that this is what international law requires, I think it's important just to step back, to take stock, and to realise that from a common sense perspective, that is very unlikely to be the case.
Today is Monday, March 2nd. This is Boundless Insights, and I'm Aviva Klompas. Since Saturday, the United States and Israel have carried out non-stop military strikes against Iran, and this has ignited a chorus of accusations. Across social media and cable news, there are people insisting that the strikes are illegal and a violation of international law. Now, the claims are made with a lot of certainty and almost no explanation. So today we're stopping to ask, what does international law actually say about the use of force? When is it permitted, and under what conditions? To answer those questions, I'm joined by Natasha Hausdorff, an expert on international law, including the law of armed conflict, foreign affairs, and national security policy. She serves as Director of the Centre for International Rule of Law and Legal Director of UK Lawyers for Israel. Let's get into it. Natasha, welcome back to Boundless Insights.
Great to be with you. Thanks.
I appreciate it very much because these are difficult and trying times. And in particular, every time I open up social media, there are people claiming that the United States and Israel violated international law by striking Iran. Now, I'll just say from the outset that most of the people making the claim are not international law experts, but that has not stopped the online pundits, members of Congress, and even world leaders from making the claim. And I want to actually give some examples. So Senator Bernie Sanders called it an illegal, premeditated, and unconstitutional war. Senator Elizabeth Warren said it's dangerous and illegal. Senator Ed Markey labeled it illegal and unconstitutional. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer said the administration has not provided Congress or the public with critical details about the threat. You have representatives like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib accusing the president of launching an illegal regime change war. California's Governor Gavin Newsom condemned the strikes as unauthorized and unconstitutional. The socialist mayor of New York, Zohran Mamdani, called it a catastrophic escalation in an illegal war of aggression. And then internationally, Spain's prime minister rejected unilateral military action and demanded full respect of international law. Norway's foreign minister said the strikes were not in line with international law, arguing that preemptive action requires an immediate, imminent threat. The European Union called for maximum restraint and respect for international law. And of course, the UN warned that the escalation undermines international peace and security. Now, I'm laying all this out in extra detail because people are going to encounter the claim that the strikes are illegal. And the purpose of the conversation I want to have with you today is to understand whether that accusation has any merit. So, Natasha, under international law, when is the use of force lawful, and when may a state act in anticipatory or preemptive self-defense?
Well, Aviva, thank you. There is a prohibition on the use of force that is encapsulated in Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. But there is a major exception to that, and that is recognised by Article 51 of the UN Charter, and that is each state's inherent right to self-defence. And it's important that I state that this is recognised as an inherent right. It's not bestowed on any states. Some people may describe it as a God-given right, but it is a right to self-defence that the framework of international law accepts, acknowledges. And then the question ultimately has to be posed, what are the extents of that right to self-defence? Because in a very basic and traditional sense, it refers to responding to an armed attack. Now, that has been extended to incorporate what have been described as preemptive strikes. You can preempt an armed attack if it is considered to be imminent. The concept of imminence has itself developed over time, and some of this is a reflection of changes in military capabilities, changes in the nature of warfare. So all of this, it's fair to say, has been the subject of fierce debate, especially since the war on terror and I'd say concerted efforts by the relevant US administrations to extend and develop concepts of imminence to facilitate the preemption of strikes in this modern era, where frankly, it's too late to wait until the enemy has their finger on the button of a nuclear arsenal
Let me ask you just a question because you said it in passing. You mentioned Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, and I believe that's what people who actually know a little bit of international law are pointing to when they say that the strikes are illegal. So can you tell us what Article 2.4 says?
Yeah, it's a general prohibition on the use of force. And from that, we get the idea of wars of aggression, wars that do not have a legal basis and a legal justification. But in this case, all of the misrepresentations of the legal position that you have set out, they misrepresent the basics of international law. And I warrant that they do so for political purposes. They are part of pursuing a political agenda. And frankly, they're able to get away with it seems, because general levels of literacy on international law are not particularly high. And so they will be able to claim a violation of international law. And as you and I have readily seen over the last couple of days, there has been very little pushback against it. And I think that is derived from the lack of knowledge. It's worth acknowledging, though, that there are some international lawyers that have jumped on this bandwagon and that have said that the resort to force by the United States and by Israel against Iran was unlawful. And those are international lawyers that are deploying the entirely incorrect legal framework to assess these strikes. Let me set that out as briefly as I possibly can. The resort to force can be justified by self-defense, and I think there's a whole separate parallel set of justifications, both for Israel's strikes and for those of the United States. And there were many references in President Trump's initial statement, keywords, buzzwords, if you will, that give a clear insight into where the US administration is at in terms of its legal analysis. But before we get to that, it's important to stress that the legal framework on a resort to force is not the correct framework to apply, at least where Israel is concerned, and probably where the US is concerned too. And it is for this reason. There are two separate frameworks regarding use of force. One is the resort to force outside of an armed conflict. And in that case, preemption is relevant, self-defense is relevant. This is, if you will, the start of an armed conflict, the first blow. The reason that that framework is not relevant here is because we have been in the midst of an armed conflict already between Iran and Israel for decades. Some may say this dates from the very start of the Iranian Islamic Revolution in 1979. Indeed, President Trump, in his remarks, made reference back to the attacks on Americans that took place from that very date, including the US hostages that were taken in the course of that revolution and the subsequent attacks on US interests around the globe by the Islamic regime in Iran since that point. But at least in Israel's case, it is clear, and it has been repeatedly stated by the Israeli government, that Israel considers itself to be in an ongoing armed conflict with the Islamic regime in Iran. So this misnomer of the 12-day war that many people refer to in June, it's a colloquialism. The reality is, of course, that this armed conflict has been in existence between Israel and Iran for many, many decades. Now, that means that the legal framework you apply is a very different one. It's the one that is referred to as jus in bello, as opposed to jus ad bellum. Jus ad bellum, the law that governs resort to force and the start of an armed conflict. Jus in bello, the law that governs an ongoing armed conflict. And the rules that govern an ongoing armed conflict, they are the laws of armed conflict that are military necessity, proportionality, distinction, and precaution. They are the rules that modern law-abiding armies adhere to in the way that they conduct their military operations, in the way that they conduct strikes. And Israel's focus on military targets, on the installations of the regime, the IRGC, on rocket launch sites, ballistic missiles capability, and all of that, those have been targeted at military installations, military targets, and that is part and parcel of Israel's compliance with the laws of armed conflict. That is a very key distinction, and it demonstrates that every single quote that you read out, all of these protestations of illegality, are based on the fundamental false wrong application of the correct legal framework so far as Israel is concerned. When we come to the United States, there are multiple possible justifications that the US can rely on. Israel is an ally of NATO. The US has every justification to assisting Israel in exercising its self-defense in this ongoing armed conflict and providing support. But there is also a very strong separate justification that the US can state, and this is what was alluded to in the president's remarks, in terms of a preemptive strike that the US considers to have been against an imminent threat. And on this, we come back to this expanding concept of imminence. When we are talking about the Iranian nuclear program, which it's clear that they were seeking to reestablish. And when one takes that together with, the repeated calls and statements that they have made that they are seeking both to wipe Israel off the map, to go after the little Satan and the big Satan, and you take that in conjunction with the continuous attacks that the United States has suffered against US interests also and US allies, then that puts into a very different context the imminence of the threat.
I think what complicates that particular point is the fact that President Trump has gone out repeatedly and said that back in June, the United States obliterated the nuclear program. So on the one hand, he's saying the threat was totally eliminated, and now we're arguing, well, there was an imminent threat.
Yes. And I fully appreciate that there are many contradictory remarks that come from the president, and that's just something that we have to perhaps take with a pinch of salt. The reason that I think that the scripted remarks at the outset of what he called major combat operations are particularly instructive is because of the use of these very well-recognized legal terms, in particular preemptive and imminent. That, to my mind at least, had been plainly scripted by the lawyers. But it's important just to recognize that the absolute, vast chasm that exists between all of the justifications that I've sort of rattled through and the very, dramatic but uncompromising statements and allegations that we've had of illegality on the other side. I think it's fair to say, just, stepping back from this, because I appreciate that, when lawyers discuss these issues, it can sound technical and it can sound somewhat impenetrable. But stepping back, the international legal order would not be worth maintaining if what these detractors of Israel and detractors of the action that the United States had taken, if these detractors were speaking accurately, if what they were saying was true, if it were impossible for Israel to successfully defeat a regime that has been calling for its extermination and taking active measures, both through proxies, but also, of course, directly against Israeli civilians, as we've seen over the last couple of years. If it were impossible for Israel, with the support of the United States, or even for the United States independently, to take action to remove those sorts of threats to US interests and US personnel, then international law wouldn't really be worth its salt.
I would say we're well past that, because I was the speechwriter for Israel at the United Nations about 10 years ago now. And I've certainly seen how international law and its institutions have lost credibility because the people that are making these claims end up defending or excusing the very actors who violate the laws most blatantly, right? They end up serving to defend the interests of countries like Iran and China and Russia, or the worst dictatorships in the world. And many of the loudest voices now claiming that the attacks were illegal are the people that were silent when Khamenei was gunning down tens of thousands of his own people. So I take that for sure. But I want to take us back to Trump's remarks, because one of the things that he said in his video statement is that the purpose of the strike was also to open the door to regime change. Now, what does international law tell us about regime change?
I just want to be very careful at the outset, though, I appreciate that's how the remarks have been reported across much of the international media. I do think that the president was very clear about what the US aims were in terms of launching the strikes, and then separately, what the opportunities that this set of circumstances might give rise to. And certainly, and I've listened to this speech now a number of times, it seems to me that there was an important distinction made between the two, that regime change is now a possibility because of the action that is being taken, but that is a matter for the Iranian people to seize that opportunity and to take back control of their country from this oppressive Islamist regime, rather than as a stated goal of the United States in pursuing regime change as an aim of these strikes. So that's really important, I think, to clarify. So far as, what does international law say about regime change? Well, there is no explicit prohibition on regime change, but there are a number of relevant, important principles that would essentially lead us to believe that action that is purely aimed at changing a regime would not be something that's legitimate in international law, including the principles of sovereignty of states, of the territorial integrity of states. If that was the pure motivation here, then that would not be a lawful justification. And therefore, I think that distinction that the president made between why the US was going to war and what the potential consequences of this could be for the benefit of the Iranian people, for the benefit of the people of the region, and for Western civilization, frankly, then that is the appropriate lens to view that through. There has been some discussion of a concept in international law of the responsibility to protect. And this can be a justification for humanitarian intervention. And given everything that we heard and saw over the last month, the horrendous slaughtering of civilians by the Islamic regime in Iran, of these individuals that had come out to protest. And of course, the president's remarks that help is on the way, that has understandably led to a discussion and a focus on whether the responsibility to protect this humanitarian principle might be relevant. The reason I think that is a bit of a dead end is that it's pretty settled in how this principle has come to be, that one would require authorization by the United Nations, in particular the Security Council of the United Nations, to have a mandate.
That's actually what I think is very important to answer, because a lot of people are saying that the only way that you can authorize the use of force is through the UN Security Council.
Yeah, that's not correct. For the responsibility to protect, if this was simply to intervene to provide protection and take down the regime for the benefit of the Iranian people alone, yes, that would require Security Council authorization. The prospects of achieving that, unfortunately, given the mechanisms of the United Nations and the veto of the P5, that would prove impossible.
To say nothing for losing the element of surprise if you're going to debate it at the United Nations, and also the fact that how many debates have there been at the UN, including the Security Council already, about Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons and its support for terrorist organizations? Countless.
Countless, and for decades. And this is a matter that I've seen reels of speeches by Benjamin Netanyahu from 2017 in the United Nations, making it clear that Israel will never allow the Iranians, the regime there, to obtain nuclear capability. So as you say, this has been a matter that has been a long time coming. The strikes themselves shouldn't have come as a surprise to the world. In many respects, they were inevitable, especially given that every attempt to achieve a negotiated resolution to prevent Iran from seeking this capability has ultimately proved unsuccessful, and the Iranians have continued to use those negotiations to their advantage, to buy time, to continue to hide their advancements of their nuclear program. But as you say, seeking UN approval to act specifically under the responsibility to protect would be a complete non-starter in this context. And part of what we understand now that triggered these major combat operations, to use the words of the president, was the ability to take out both the Ayatollah and some of his chief command in this meeting, intelligence that the Israelis and the Americans acted on that's part and parcel of why it is so important to be clear about what the legal basis and the lawful justifications of these strikes are. Not to do with responsibility to protect, not to do with purely to do with preemption and an imminence of a threat, but to do with that existing ongoing armed conflict, which is why, when the world and his wife are coming out to say that this is illegal, they are deploying the wrong framework in international law, misrepresenting what the proper applicable international law is. And frankly, I don't think most of these people have looked into it. They are simply parroting what they consider to be.
Well, they were previously experts in COVID, then they became experts in Ukraine and Russia, and now they're currently experts in Iranian nuclear proliferation and the laws of armed conflict. Let me pivot and ask you a slightly different question. Until June, Iran rarely attacked directly. Instead, the way that it operates is by funding, arming, and directing terror groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis. So how does international law treat state responsibility for the actions of proxy forces?
Hold states responsible where they are directing those forces. There's also an arguable responsibility that is implied if a state is providing a sufficient level of support to proxies. But in this case, there's no question, and this is set out under the Articles of State Responsibility for Wrongful Acts, there's no question the level of direction, control that the Islamic regime in Iran has had over Hezbollah, over Hamas, over its proxies in Iraq and Syria, and others. The level of direction and control more than passes the threshold for Iran to be held responsible under that applicable international law.
Held responsible to the extent that a strike would be permitted, or that it would actually be sanctions or other measures?
Well, either would apply. Of course, the ability to use force is the preserve of those states acting in self-defense, or ultimately those states that are acting in support of states that are acting in their self-defense, or on the authorization of the United Nations. So when I say responsible, that's a matter of state responsibility in international law that could absolutely be used to justify sanctions at the United Nations, or in extreme circumstances, it could also cause the UN to sanction the use of force by the member states of the United Nations. I mean, that hasn't happened here, I think, for obvious political reasons.
Right.
But that is a basis upon which there could be an effort at the UN in perhaps other contexts to seek endorsement for military action.
I want to ask one last question. If listeners take away one legal insight from this conversation, something that will help them go out into the world and push back on all the misinformation that's being circulated, what would you suggest?
Well, perhaps more than a legal insight, it might be a sort of practical common sense insight. And it is to do with the nature of international law. International law has been developed by states according to their interests. At its heart, at its core, is the desire to promote peace and stability, to prevent war, and to enable states to enjoy their sovereign rights without interference from others. That is, I think, extremely important to hold on to when we find ourselves in a situation where so much of the international legal discussion is being hijacked by those that perhaps don't have the best interests of Western liberal democracies, or indeed Western civilization, at heart. And when people present nonsensical positions justified by this claim that this is what international law requires, I think it's important just to step back, to take stock, and to realize that from a common sense perspective, that is very unlikely to be the case. It is very unlikely to be an accurate reflection of international law, for the very reason that it has developed in accordance with the interests of states, and the interests of states that view law as a curtailment on government power, and that respect the rule of law on that basis. I think the contrary is that we've seen the despots and dictatorships of this world that view law as a means of wielding power. We've seen concerted efforts by them to hijack the narrative around international law. And if I can leave some of your audience just with the reassurance that that is not what real international law says. and that it's important to constantly push back on that. When someone says X, Y, or Z violates international law, ask them which law. For the most part, those making these statements, I think, will be unable to furnish you with a response because there has been this, mob mentality, received wisdom that has been making these unfounded allegations.
Thank you, Natasha, so much. That's a wrap on today's episode of Boundless Insights. Whether you've been with us from the start or are just discovering our show, we're so glad you're here. If today's conversation sparked a question, challenged your thinking, or made you shake your head, I want to hear from you. Email me at podcast@boundlessisrael.org. Your feedback gives us ideas for new topics and new guests. And if you believe these conversations matter, there are 3 ways to support the show. First, hit that follow button so you never miss an episode. Second, help us spread the word. Share an episode with friends and family, post about it, or mention it in a group chat. It really does make a difference. And third, consider supporting our work. Boundless is a nonprofit, and we rely on donors to keep the show going. You can make a gift at boundlessisrael.org/donate. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep the conversation going.